greatly appreciate everybody coming out to hear me tonight. It's quite an honor when so many people show up. I've been at the university now for 31 years, and over the course of those 31 years, I've taught a lot of students, and a good number of them are here tonight. And it's good to see all those old faces. The subject I'm going to talk about tonight is what I think will be the most important question of the 21st century, and that is whether or not China can rise peacefully. And before I get into the nuts and bolts of my talk, I want to make two preliminary remarks. First of all, you want to remember that I am assuming that China will continue to grow pretty much over the next 20 or 30 years the way it's grown over the past 20 or 30 years. In other words, it's not going to hit the flat of the curve, or it's not going to slow down drastically in terms of its economic growth. I'm assuming, as I like to say, that it is eventually going to turn into a giant Hong Kong. And I just want to point out that that's an assumption. I'm not saying that's going to happen. If you look at the literature on this subject, there are people on both sides, very smart people on both sides, people who think that China's in trouble and it will not grow at a rapid pace over the next 20 or 30 years, and people who think the opposite. I have no opinion. I'm just assuming that it's going to continue to grow. And you also want to remember, as I talk here, that the problem that we're talking about is a problem that is 20 or 30 years down the road. It is not a problem that occurs in 2 or 3 years. It's a problem that arises when China is much more powerful than it is today. This brings me to my second preliminary point. You cannot answer the question, can China rise peacefully, without a theory. It is a theoretical question. And the reason is that we have no facts about the future. If you come down here to Washington, you ask people, can China rise peacefully? You'll run into all sorts of individuals who will say, I was just in Beijing last week and I talked to person X, Y, and Z. And after talking to those people, I'm convinced that China can rise peacefully. I always say, this is a bunch of hooey. X, Y, and Z will probably be 5 feet under in 30 years. And the people who will be running China are probably little kids now. And how can you know what they'll be thinking when they're in power 20 or 30 years down the road? To put it in slightly different terms, we have no facts about the future because the future hasn't happened yet. So you need a theory, right, to explain how you expect China to behave as it gets more and more powerful, and how you expect the United States to respond, and how you expect China's neighbors to respond. You need a theory of great power politics. This brings me to the nuts and bolts of my talk. My talk comes in 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to give you my theory of great power politics, number 1. Then number 2, I'm going to give you a synoptic version of American foreign policy from 1783, when we got our independence from Britain, up to the present. And of course, what I'm going to do when I lay out American foreign policy from 1783 to the present is I'm going to try and convince you that the United States has behaved according to the dictates of my theory, right? Because I have to give you some confidence that my theory is not just something that I made up that is interesting but not relevant to the real world. So the second part of my talk, again, focuses on the United States from 1783 to the present, and what I'm trying to do is marry the American experience to the theory. And then the third part of the talk is I'm going to talk about China and how China is likely to behave as it gets more and more powerful. And of course, the argument I'm going to make is that China will behave the way the United States has behaved, which is the way the theory predicts. And I will argue that the United States will respond to China the way it's responded to Imperial Japan, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. So I'll show continuity over time. Again, all for the purposes of giving you confidence that the theory is correct. So let me start with my theory of great power politics, then go to the American experience, and then talk about the rise of China. My theory starts with 5 simple assumptions about how the world works. You take those 5 assumptions, you put them in the blender, you hit the on switch, and you get a lot of trouble. Okay? So let me tell you what the 5 assumptions are. The first assumption is that states are the principal actors in international politics, and they operate in what is called an anarchic system. Now, when you use the word anarchy, for most people that means murder and mayhem. That's not what it means in international relations speak. Anarchy is simply an ordering principle that says that there's no higher authority that sits above states. It's the opposite of hierarchy. Anarchy means that states are like pool balls on a table with no higher authority above them. Okay? So when we say the system is anarchic, we're not saying it is a rough and tumble system. We're simply saying that there's no higher authority that sits above states. The UN, the League of Nations, come on, let's be serious, right? States are the principal actors in the system. Assumption number one. Assumption number two has to do with capabilities. And there the argument is that every state in the system has some offensive military capability. There's no question that there's great variation among states in the system. If you were to take a country like the United States, take a country like Israel, take a country like Britain, these are countries that have a significant amount of offensive military capability. If you were, on the other hand, to look at countries like Belgium or Jordan or Guatemala, these are countries that have remarkably little offensive military capability, but they have some. So my argument is that all states have some offensive military capability, although some states have much more than others. The third assumption is of enormous importance, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on it just so we're perfectly clear, because it does a lot to drive the theory. And the third assumption has to do with intentions. Second assumption had to do with capabilities, offensive capabilities. The third assumption has to do with intentions. Here, the argument is that states can never be sure about the intentions of other states. And they certainly cannot be sure about future intentions. Now let me unpack this a bit. The reason that it's so hard to assess another state's intentions is because intentions are inside decision makers' heads. And you can't get inside people's heads and see what their intentions are. It's very different than the situation that exists with regard to capabilities. Capabilities usually involve material things, and you can see them and measure them. During the Cold War, for example, and there are a number of old dogs in this audience who remember the Cold War. Remember, we used to look at the Soviet Union, trying to assess the Soviet threat, and we could always come up with a pretty good picture of what their capabilities looked like. We could count the number of tanks they had, we could count the number of SS-18s, the number of boomers, and so forth and so on. We could assess the quality of them. It was quite easy to assess Soviet capabilities. We could never reach agreement on Soviet intentions. People on the left thought that the Soviets basically had benign intentions and it was the United States that was driving the Cold War. People on the right thought that the Soviet Union had evil intentions and it was the Soviet Union that was driving the Cold War. We still do not know for sure whether the Soviets had benign or malign intentions. And if you go back to World War I, as you all know, the origins of World War I started August 1914. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary. There's going to be a huge literature that comes out next year, and we're going to debate who caused World War I and whether or not Germany was responsible. And what the debate is going to devolve down to is a question of what German intentions were in August or during the July crisis of 1914. We still have no agreement on what German intentions were, but we know what German capabilities were, right? So the point is very hard to assess intentions. Now, if you say, John, I disagree. I think if you look around today, it's not easy, but it's possible to divine what another state's intentions are. My Sunday punch is to say, all right, I'll give you that, but you can't tell me what the future intentions of any state will be, because you can't tell me who will be running Germany in 10 years. You can't tell me who will be running China in 20 years. So there's no way you can divine what their intentions will be. So my argument here is that it is very difficult to know the intentions of other states. This is not to say you can be sure that another state will have malign intentions. It's just that you can't be sure. I want to lay out one final example just to drive this home. It has nothing to do with international relations. It has to do with divorce. Anytime two people get married, they assume, at least in 99.9% of the cases, that the person they're marrying has benign intentions toward them. Otherwise, why would they get married? But as you know, we have a divorce rate around 50%. And in many of those cases, the husband and wife end up hating each other. And in some cases, having really malign intentions towards the other person. All of this is to say that any time you get married, and this is a very depressing thought, but nevertheless true, you can never be certain that the person you're marrying will have benign intentions toward you for the duration. Again, that's not to say that the person you're marrying will have malign intentions. It's just to say you cannot be certain what the other person's intentions will be over time. So I've laid out three assumptions for you. One is that the system is anarchic. There's no higher authority that sits above states. That's one. Two is all of those states in the system have some offensive military capability. Varies greatly, but all have some offensive capability. And three, you cannot be certain about the intentions of other states. 4 and 5 are very simple. 4 says that the principal goal of states is to survive. Survival is the numero uno goal of states. This is not to say that the only goal of states is survival. There are many other goals. Prosperity, projecting your values abroad, plenty of goals. But the number one goal has to be survival, for the obvious reason that if you don't survive, you can't pursue any of the other goals. So survival is the principal goal. Fifth assumption is that states are basically rational actors. This is the famous rational actor assumption. Another way to put this is that states are strategic calculators. Okay, so 4 is survival, 5 is the rational actor assumption. 1 is anarchy, 2 is some offensive military capabilities, 3, uncertainty about intentions. Those are the 5 assumptions. You take them, you put them in the blender, you hit the on switch, trouble. Why? Well, the first behavior that you get when you mix up these assumptions is fear. States fear each other. Now the question is, why do they fear each other? They fear each other for 2 reasons. First of all, they fear each other because it's always possible you'll end up living next door to a state that is got a lot of offensive capability and malign intentions toward you. There's always a chance you'll end up next door to Imperial Germany or Nazi Germany. And the second reason that you fear states is because of what I call the 911 problem. There's no higher authority. It's an anarchic system. So when you dial 911 in the international system, you know who's at the other end? Nobody. Nobody's at the other end. It's an anarchic system. This leads to the second form of behavior, self-help. States quickly figure out that it's a self-help system. As my mother would say, God helps those who help themselves. This applies in international politics, right? It's a self-help system. So number 1, states fear each other. Again, the level of fear can vary from case to case, but deep down inside, there's that fear. Number 2, states understand it's a self-help system. Number 3, you understand very quickly that to be secure, and remember, survival is your principal goal here. To survive in the international system, the best way to do it is to be, as we used to say in New York when I was a boy, the biggest and baddest dude on the block. To put it in social science speak, the name of the game is to maximize your relative power. Because the more powerful you are, the less likely it is anybody will fool around with you. How many of you go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico or Guatemala or Cuba attacking the United States? You say, this is unthinkable. No country in this hemisphere would dare attack us. Why? Because we're Godzilla. Exactly. The name of the game is to be extremely powerful. In an anarchic system where there's nobody at the other end when you dial 911, and you cannot be certain about the intentions of other states, and those other states may have a whole heck of a lot of offensive capability, you want to be very powerful. Because if you're very powerful, you're then very secure. To be a bit more specific, what you want to do is you want to be the hegemon in the system. Now, what exactly does it mean to be the hegemon in the system? My argument is that the planet that we live on is too big and it has too much water for any one country to be a global hegemon. And I believe, by the way, that one of the reasons that the United States has gotten itself into a lot of trouble since the Cold War ended is that we operate under the illusion that we can be a global hegemon. You can't do it. The globe's too big. You get yourself into too much trouble. The best you can do in my story is be a regional hegemon. You can dominate your region of the world. And I'm going to make the argument soon that there's only been one regional hegemon in modern history, and that is the United States of America in the Western Hemisphere. But the name of the game, if you're interested in survival, if you're interested in maximizing your survival, is to be a regional hegemon. That's goal number one. Goal number two is to make sure you do not have a peer competitor, to make sure that no other state dominates its region of the world the way you dominate yours. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, why is it important not to have a peer competitor? It's all about the freedom to roam. Now, you're saying to yourself, what is he talking about? Freedom to roam. Most of you have never thought much about this, I'm sure. But why is it that the United States is wandering all over God's little green acre, sticking its nose in everybody's business? Why is that? It is because we have no security threats in the Western Hemisphere that we have to worry about. We're so dominant in the Western Hemisphere that we are free to roam around the globe. If we had 5 or 6 powerful states in our region, and we had bad relations with 2 or 3 of them, we would have to focus much more on the Western Hemisphere than we do. So we are free to roam into others' backyards. What the United States does not want is another country to be free to roam into its backyard. So what you want, let's just go to Europe for a second, is you want a situation where Imperial Germany or Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union has to worry about its neighborhood more than the Western Hemisphere. If Germany conquers all of Europe and is a regional hegemon in Europe, it is then free to roam. And that means free to roam into the Western Hemisphere. And the United States does not want anybody roaming into the Western Hemisphere. We want to be free to roam into other people's backyards, but we do not want them roaming into our backyard. And I'll talk more about this as we go along. So the story I have told you about my theory is that starting with these 5 assumptions, 5 rather simple assumptions, you end up in a world where if you are interested in maximizing your prospects for survival, the best way to survive is number 1, to be a regional hegemon, and number 2, to make sure you have no peer competitor, which is another way of saying you want to make sure you're the only regional hegemon on the planet. Right? So that's the basic theory. Now what I want to do is talk about the United States of America from 1783 to the present. And the argument I want to make is if you look at how we have behaved over time, we have behaved according to the dictates of my theory. None of you have been educated to think this way because you grow up in liberal America where we tell ourselves all these false tales about our history, where we're portrayed as noble people who do nothing but good on the world stage and so forth. So that's not the way it's operated over time. Let's go back to 1783. In the beginning, the United States was comprised of 13 measly colonies strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. What happened over the next 70 or so years is that the United States marched from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific Ocean. We murdered huge numbers of Native Americans. We stole their land. We went to war with Mexico and stole from them what is the southwest of the United States. We invaded Canada in 1812 for the express purpose of incorporating Canada into the United States. The British and the Canadians worried throughout the 19th century that we were going to pay them a return visit because they knew that we had a voracious appetite. Much of the Caribbean would today be American were it not for the slavery issue. The southern states were desperate to expand into the Caribbean to make all sorts of territory in that part of the world, part of the United States of America, and what prevented it was the northern states did not want any more slaveholding states in the Union. As you well know, sugar was the main industry in the Caribbean, and sugar was a labor-intensive industry. That meant there were huge numbers of slaves in the Caribbean, and the northern states did not want more slave-holding states. So not only did we have our gun sights on the Pacific Ocean, we also had our gun sights to the north on Canada, and we had our gun sights to the south. There's no country in modern history that has a record of expansion that comes close to ours. It's no accident that when Adolf Hitler went into the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, for the next few months he talked frequently about doing in the Soviet Union what the United States did in North America. That's how the United States was created. A very powerful state, very aggressive state. Second thing we had to do to establish hegemony in this hemisphere is we had to get the European empires out. You all remember President James Monroe in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine, he basically told the European great powers, this is our hemisphere. We're eventually going to throw you out. We're not powerful enough to do it, but you're leaving. It's just a matter of when. And once you leave, you are not welcome back here. Again, there are enough of us in this audience to remember the Cold War. You remember how we used to go ballistic when the Soviets would do certain things in places like Cuba? Talk about putting missiles in Cuba, troops in Cuba, building a naval base at Cienfuegos. This was not acceptable to us. This was our hemisphere. We were bent on establishing regional hegemony. So my point is that by 1900, in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the United States had established regional hegemony. And as I said before, this is the only regional hegemon in modern history. Now, you have two goals. One is to establish regional hegemony, and two is to make sure there's no peer competitor. What happened in the 20th century? There were four potential peer competitors: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. The United States had no intention of allowing any of those countries to dominate Europe, Asia, or in the case of the Soviet Union, Eurasia. We entered World War I in April 1917, when it looked like the Germans might win that war, and we helped finish off the Germans. If I had an extra hour, I could give you my lecture on how I think the United States played the critical role in tipping the balance in favor of the French and British against the Germans. In World War II, we defeated Japan almost single-handedly, and we played a key role, although the Soviets played the key role, in defeating Nazi Germany in Europe. And of course, during the Cold War, we played the principal role in containing the Soviet Union, and then we helped usher it down the toilet bowl when the Cold War ended. And we were glad to see it go. And after it ended, we made it clear to the rest of the world that we had no intention of giving up American primacy. So the United States has a very clear record of not tolerating peer competitors. And we've actually been quite explicit about that. So the argument I'm making to you is if you look at the basic theory that I laid out, and you look at how the United States has really behaved since 1783, it fits very neatly with the theory. This brings me to the third part of the talk, which has to do with China. And of course, my argument is that China will imitate the United States. Now, let's just talk about maximizing relative power. Don't you think the Chinese, given their history over the past 150 years, understand the importance of really being powerful? You know what happened to the Chinese when they were weak? It was really quite terrible. They refer to it as the century of national humiliation. They had the Japanese, the Europeans, and the Americans with their open door policy, exploiting them left and right, occupying them, killing large numbers of people. You go to Beijing, you ask any person this simple question. You have two choices. You can be 10 times more powerful than Japan, or Japan can be 10 times more powerful than you. Do you think it matters? What do you think the Chinese are going to say? The Chinese are going to tell you it is very important to be very powerful. We understand what happened in the past when we were weak. So they will go to great lengths to maximize their relative power. They will want to make sure that the power gap between them and Russia, them and Japan, them and India is as wide as possible. Just like we're very content with the fact that Canada and Mexico and Guatemala are small fish compared to us. It's not because we're evil. It's because it's the best way to survive in the international system. So number one, you can expect the Chinese to want to maximize their relative power, to grow and build a powerful military. Second, you don't think the Chinese are going to have a Monroe Doctrine? You think it's okay for us to be terribly upset when the Soviets send troops or missiles to Cuba, but they shouldn't get upset when we run aircraft carriers or aircraft up and down their coast because we're a benign hegemon or some nonsense like that. My mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. The same basic logic that applies to us should apply to them. Why shouldn't they want a Monroe Doctrine? If I were the national security advisor in Beijing and they asked me whether or not we should work hard to have our own Monroe Doctrine and push the Americans out beyond what they call the first island chain or beyond what they call the second island chain, I'd do everything I could to push the Americans out. I'd want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. Is that because the Chinese are evil? Is it because they have a different culture than we do? Absolutely not. My argument here, as you've all surely figured out, is a structural argument. The structure of the international system leaves you little choice when you're powerful but to try and dominate your region of the world. So you read the newspapers over the next 20, 30 years, you'll see lots of evidence of the Chinese talking about dominating Asia, about pushing the Americans as far away as possible, because they're not going to be happy about our aircraft carriers and our aircraft and our ground troops sitting on their doorstep for the same reason we're never happy when anybody does that to us. Now, what is the United States likely to do? How's the United States likely to respond? The record here is very clear. Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. We're not going to allow China to dominate Asia. This is the basis of the pivot to Asia. Right? And this is just the beginning. We're not going to tolerate that. We do not tolerate peer competitors. And we'll go to enormous lengths to contain the Chinese. Chinese will go to enormous lengths to push us out, and we'll go to enormous lengths to contain them. Because again, you see our great fear is that if the Chinese dominate Asia, they'll be free to roam. You can already see the Chinese roaming in Asia. You can see them roaming in the Persian Gulf. And I'm not being critical of them for 1 second. I say this admiringly as a good realist. Right? They roam, but we do not want them roaming into our backyard. Great powers like the United States do not tolerate that. So we'll go to great lengths to contain them. Right? And then the question you have to ask yourself is, what will the neighbors do? Well, the neighbors will almost all balance with us. You can already see this beginning to happen. Just go home and Google Japan and India. Japan and India, despite the fact that they're separated by great distances and a lot of water, have basically jumped into bed together. And they're playing kissy face with each other. And they're doing it mainly because of China. The United States and India, I often say to students, why are the United States and India such good friends today? And of course, the normal American answer is because they're both democracies. To which I say, that can't be the answer because we were both democracies during the Cold War and we didn't get along with each other. Right? In fact, the Indians did not like us at all. Right? And we didn't really have much time for them during the Cold War. Something changed. And that something that changed is China. Right? The Indians are very nervous about China. And we are very nervous about China. So you can see the United States and the Indians moving closer together. The balancing coalition will look like this. It'll include Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, Indonesia, India, Russia, and the United States. Those will be the core players. Right? And the interesting question is what happens with countries like Pakistan, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. Right? Those are the four that are likely to be on the other side. But we will have all the powerful countries in Asia on our side. They'll be part of the balancing coalition. And the main reason is that those countries live next door to China, and China is much more of a threat to them than the United States is. Same reason everybody balanced against the Soviet Union and didn't balance against the United States, because the Soviet Union, being a neighbor of the countries in Europe and in Northeast Asia, was a much greater threat than the United States was. So that'll be the balancing coalition. One final problem that you want to keep in mind as you think about this is what we in the international relations world call the security dilemma. The security dilemma says that almost anything a state does to defend itself looks offensive to the other side. In other words, the security dilemma is predicated on the belief that it's very difficult to distinguish between offensive and defensive capabilities. So if you're China and I'm the United States, and I see you building up your military forces, and I say, I have to start swinging submarines and aircraft carriers into the Pacific Ocean to defend my interests against you, China. It looks defensive to me. But from China's point of view, these carriers and these attack submarines coming into the Pacific Ocean looks very offensive in nature. So as you have surely noticed, anytime the Chinese increase their defense budget, we scream that they're developing offensive capabilities. They're on the march, right? And they say, absolutely not. This is defensive. We're just defending ourselves. We've got the United States on our doorstep. We have to build up our military capabilities to protect ourselves. So you have this pernicious situation that's unavoidable because of the difficulty of distinguishing between offense and defense, where anything that one side does to defend itself looks offensive to the other side. And because you cannot know intentions, going back to my point about intentions, you see those offensive capabilities as a signal of offensive intentions. So what's going to happen over time is that you're going to have an arms race, and that arms race is going to have the pernicious effect of making both sides think that the other side is behaving in very aggressive ways. Let me conclude by saying that my argument tonight is based on a theory. As I say, I think there's no way you can talk about the rise of China without a theory. And of course, there are theories, different theories, which tell a different story than the one I just told you. But my theory, like any social science theory, gets it right at best about 75% of the time. Now you're probably saying to yourself, why is this the case? The world is an incredibly complicated place. And the reason we have theories is to help us make sense of this complicated world. And what theories are simplified pictures of reality. But when you come up with a theory, what you do is you leave all sorts of factors on the cutting room floor. My theory has no role in it for domestic politics. I don't care whether a country is a democratic state, a communist state, a dictatorship, or a fascist state. For me, states are black boxes. Domestic politics doesn't figure in my story. I leave domestic politics on the cutting room floor. Other theories leave considerations that I emphasize, like power, on the cutting room floor. The problem is that in the real world, sometimes those factors that you leave on the cutting room floor jump up and bite you in the hiney. And your theory doesn't apply in those particular cases. This is why I say no social science theory, in my humble opinion, gets it right more than 75% of the time. And not many get it right 75% of the time. All of this is to say there is some reasonable chance that as good as my theory might be at explaining the past, it's not perfect, and I may be wrong. Given the grim story that I've told, let's hope that this is one of those times my theory is wrong. Thank you. I'll be glad to take all the questions I can answer, but I would ask whoever asks a question to limit your question to 30 seconds and to try and be as succinct as possible and limit it to one question, just so we can get as many people as possible. And I promise not to try not to be long-winded in answering your questions. Sir.
Warren Coates, Economics Department, here. Your 5 principles, your theory, the first principle is an anarchic world. What if you replace that assumption with a superstructure? What would it look like in your mind that would be most likely to succeed?
Everybody heard the question, right? If you take any one of my 5 assumptions and you take that assumption off the table, you challenge it or you destroy it, however you want to put it, then the theory falls apart, okay? If you go from anarchy to hierarchy, then the theory doesn't work, okay? So if we could come up with a system that was hierarchic, the story I'm telling would not apply. The problem that we face is we have never been able to figure out how to transcend anarchy, how to transcend the state system. And the reason we are never going to transcend the state system in your lifetime or my lifetime is because nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet, and nationalism privileges the nation state. There's no country in the world that wants to give up its sovereignty to a higher authority, and that includes the United States of America. We want to be the most powerful state on the planet. We want to be a regional hegemon and have no peer competitor. But the idea that we're going to give up our sovereignty to some higher authority that we do not have control over by definition is not going to happen. So my answer to you is that there is no practical way to transcend anarchy.
Let me challenge or ask about another assumption, which is the continued growth of China. And what if it does flatten out? What does that do to your theory and your assumptions? Because a lot of people think it's going to flatten out.
Yeah. My view on this issue is I hope it flattens out, right? I've been to China a number of times, and I'm going on October 31st. I love going to China. China is filled with realists. When I go to China and I speak to groups, I come in and I say, it's good to be back among my people. And you can see smoke coming out of people's ears because I speak 0 words of Chinese. I can't even recognize my own name in Chinese. I feel like culturally I'm on Jupiter, but I love going to China and I love talking to the Chinese who love IR theory in general, and many of them love realism, unlike the United States where very few people like realism. But having said all that, I hope that the Chinese economy flattens and that it doesn't grow. And this whole problem just doesn't present itself, because as an American, I would prefer a situation where we are by far the most powerful state in the world and have no potential peer competitor. If it does happen that China does not continue to grow, then this problem does not materialize. However, there's a whole literature that says there could be a heck of a lot of trouble anyway. It's a different kind of trouble that I'm describing, where you have two gorillas, right, staring at each other eyeball to eyeball, kind of like the Cold War. But there's a piece by Avery Goldstein in the most recent issue, or the previous issue, of International Security that details the sorts of trouble, like over the Senkaku or Diao Islands or over Taiwan, that could occur absent this growth that we're talking about. So there's a lot of potential for trouble in Asia, absent the scenario I described. But I just hope that you and your friends who think China is not going to grow are correct.
You mentioned the balancing powers in Asia: Japan, Australia, Indonesia, India, Russia. How much will that hold back? I mean, it seems that's a lot of power there combined with, aligned with the United States. And how does your theory explain that Canada and Mexico didn't balance, or at least it's been a long time since they balanced with an alternative power?
Balanced against us?
Yes. Against us.
Yeah. Well, the only country that could really balance against us over the course of our history was Britain. And Britain thought about intervening in the American Civil War on the side of the South, because the British understood, apropos my logic, that the best situation for them, so they thought, would be to have two independent states in North America, one called the Union, the other called the Confederacy. So the British thought long and hard about intervening. And before that, they were allying with Native American tribes against us. They allied with Texas when it was an independent state. They were trying to prevent us from dominating the Western Hemisphere. It was just impossible to do, largely because of immigration. Starting in around 1835, the United States started bringing in large numbers of hyphenated Americans, mainly Irish and German to begin with. And over the course of the 19th century, we just brought in so many people. We conquered so much territory that we were just so big that they didn't think they could defeat us. The other reason that they did not pick a fight with us was because they were not free to roam. And the British were very concerned about politics on the continent. Most people don't know this, but the British facilitated the unification of Germany under Bismarck, because the British foolishly thought that the greatest threat was France, and to a lesser extent Russia. And they thought that creating a united Germany in the center of Europe, right, would help them with Russia, and more importantly, help them with France. But what you see is that the British were focused in very important ways on the continent, and that prevented them from roaming, right? That coupled with the fact that the United States just was getting so powerful. Let me get this.
Hi. My question is, if there's no peer competitor, then doesn't that leave the United States in a position to really bully any country it wants to? Going back to what you talked, I've worked with Native Americans for decades and know, their view of history which you described. But we have played that role in many countries. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I agree completely. I think when the Cold War ended in 1989, and the Soviet Union effectively disappeared over the course of the next 2 years, we entered a world where you can say either it was unipolar, which means there was only one great power, the United States, or you could say it's multipolar. Russia and China were also great powers, but they were both so weak that there was no way they could challenge the United States. Whether you think it's unipolar or unbalanced multipolar, the United States was free to roam and free to cause all sorts of trouble. So I like to point out to groups, the United States has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. We have fought 6 different wars. We are addicted to war. When you come to Washington, it's like going to a place that is constantly thinking about who the next target is. We almost went to war against Syria. We're talking about going to war against Iran. The principal reason that this is the case is because we have no great power competitor. And if you think about the story that I'm telling you a story where China rises and great power politics, great power versus great power politics come back in a way that they obtained before 1990. Think about 1900 to 1990, Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and then I'm telling you about China down the road. But in between, no great power. So we're free to run around the world remaking it in our own image. And the consequences are not pretty, in my opinion.
Hi, my name's Kateri Carmola. You were my professor in 1985, made me who I am. I'm now a professor of warfare. Anyway, could you, thank you. I speak for many of here who had you as a professor. It was a lecture on World War I.
World War I.
And the industrial strength of the various countries. Anyway, in Cobb Hall. Could you speak, please, about Africa, Africa and the role of China economically in Africa and the corresponding security role of the U.S.?
Could you say what the question is?
So could you speak about China's economic dominance or increasing economic dominance in Africa and the U.S.'s corresponding sort of military, it's a small pivot with a small p to Africa?
Yeah. I think that there are 3 areas of the world that are worth fighting and dying for. 1 is Europe, 2 is Northeast Asia, and 3 is the Persian Gulf, not the Middle East, the Persian Gulf. Europe and Northeast Asia are strategically important. They're core strategic interests, Europe and Northeast Asia, because that's where other great powers are. And the Persian Gulf is of great importance because of oil, okay? I do not believe Africa is a core strategic interest for us or for the Chinese. I think that there's no question that we will compete with the Chinese there, but it will not be that serious. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had a serious contest over 3 areas: Europe, Asia, Northeast Asia, and the Gulf, right? Not Africa. This is not to say that, you know, in places like Angola we didn't mix it up, but not serious, okay? And I think the same thing will apply to China with regard to Africa. Africa is not that important. The area where we're going to mix it up with them in a serious way is the Gulf, because they are highly dependent and becoming increasingly dependent on oil and gas out of the Gulf. And that is going to have significant consequences for our foreign policy and for the kinds of military forces that we build. And it not only has consequences for building a rapid deployment force or power projection into the Gulf, it also says all sorts of things about the SLOCs, or the sea lines of communication, that go from the Gulf through the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, up through the South China Sea. You know the whole story. So it's the Gulf that I would focus on. But if I'm wrong, and it is Africa, that sea lane or sea line of communication argument still applies. They have the
So I have a question about the concept of an arms race between the U.S. and China, where the U.S. is a primarily capital-intensive economy, and so are a lot of our other competitors for peer level, Germany especially, where it's much easier to translate that capital-intensive economy into an offensive military capability, where China is much more labor-intensive, where it's more costly and you have to import a lot more. in order to build the same level of offensive military capability. So do you think that China can realistically compete even if we do get into this arms race?
Well, my argument would be that as the Chinese economy matures and gets bigger and looks more like the Western economies, it will be able to, create the sort of military might that we have. And even if it doesn't, the fact that, this is a country that has 4 times the population of the United States. Right? One of the counter-arguments to me, by the way, here is that China may become so powerful there's nothing we can do about it. Right? If China has a per capita GNP that looks like Taiwan or looks like Hong Kong or looks like South Korea, right, it is going to be so much more powerful than the United States. We've never been up against the state. The Soviet Union probably had at its height about 1/3 the gross national product of the United States. Probably about 1/3 the gross national product of the United States. Germany, Japan, especially Japan, not anywhere near as powerful as the United States, even Imperial Germany. We could be facing a situation with China where it is just so powerful that it dominates Asia. It's sort of the story I told you about how we ended up dominating the Western Hemisphere. There was only one country that could stop us. That was Britain. They were too far away, pinned down, worrying about events in Europe and so forth and so on. And that could happen out there. Well, this is to say that even if they're not as good at translating their economic might into military might, as your question implies, they could still build one heck of a lot of military capability, and we're taking them on in their own backyard, 6,000 miles away from the continental United States. From California to China, 6,000 miles. So they're in their backyard. That's a huge power projection problem for us. So Chinese could be very, very powerful.
Hi, Soren Dayton. I wanted to follow up on your resource comments coming from Africa. I was struck earlier today when I was reading a speech given by someone at the State Department in Singapore, of all places, where this person said, it's a conference on energy policy. OPEC projects that China will soon surpass the United States to become the leading oil importer, and the IEA estimates that the U.S. will overtake Saudi Arabia as the world's largest exporter of oil. How does the sort of sharp imbalances on the resource issue play into your view here, or does it not? Yeah.
Well, I think the Chinese are going to continue to import oil from the Persian Gulf. And as I said before, I think that because they're going to be highly dependent on that oil coming out of the Gulf, they're going to care about being militarily involved there, and they're going to worry about their sea lines of communication to the Gulf. So I think what you read doesn't affect that. There is the argument that's made sometimes that in the American case, because we are becoming energy independent, that we won't have to worry about the Gulf anymore. I actually don't believe that. I think we will continue to worry about the Gulf because you're talking about a global oil market. And
yeah, the other point is us as a supplier, how does that play in, right? So it's not just a competitor for those resources somewhere, but a supplier as well, as well. Does it just sort of extend the analysis in a sort of obvious way, or do you change it at all?
I wouldn't change it.
I also took your World War I class. It's great. I guess this is probably a good lead off of that question. How does the intense relationship, the trade relationship between the United States and China, does that play into your theory, or is that also kind of left on the chopping block?
Yeah. I'd say that the two main arguments that I have heard over the years against me are, number two, the argument that China is a Confucian culture and therefore it's a peaceful culture. This is sort of the American version of we're peaceful, everybody else is aggressive, right? It's the American exceptionalism argument dressed up as Chinese Confucianism, or what I call Confucian pacifism. That's the second argument I often hear against me. The argument that is clearly the number one argument against me, wherever I go, is the argument that this gentleman laid out, which is economic interdependence theory. And the argument is that we're all hooked on capitalism. We operate in this global market, and who in their right mind would kill the goose that lays the golden egg, right? And I have a lot of different responses to that. I'll just give you a couple of them. One is that there will certainly be some situations where that logic kicks in and facilitates peace, right? I wouldn't say it's a stupid argument, it's an idiotic argument, it never applies anywhere, right? The question is, how confident are you that it is a robust enough theory that it's going to carry the day in almost all cases? First of all, you want to doubt that it's a robust theory because there was a tremendous amount of economic interdependence before World War I, and you still had World War I. Second example I would use is Taiwan. The Chinese have made it clear that if Taiwan declares its independence, China will go to war over Taiwan today, right? If Taiwan declares its independence. And the Chinese fully understand that that will have negative economic consequences. What the Chinese are telling you is that politics trumps economics, right? The Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands that the Japanese and the Chinese have been barking at each other over, it is not likely, but it's possible that you could get a war over those islands during the next year, right? Why is that the case? Because of national fervor in both countries, because both countries think it's an important area strategically. You can agree or disagree with that, but you can hypothesize situations, plausible situations, where politics trumps economics, right? And I think in almost all cases, politics does trump economics. And then the final point I would make to you is that the theory assumes that everybody's getting rich. But what if you have a depression? What if you have significant economic problems? And what's happening in country A is having a negative impact on what happens in country B. So my bottom line is that is clearly the theory that almost everybody comes after me with. It is a theory that has some power, but not much power.
I think you just answered my question. How does your theory incorporate this financial crisis that was created in Washington, New York, and it has spread out all over the world? And is this opportunity for China to surpass the United States?
Did you not hear it? Yeah. Her question was, how does my theory incorporate economic considerations of the sort that we were just talking about?
Financial crisis.
The financial crisis that's happened since 2008 and so forth and so on. And the answer is it doesn't. This gentleman has an alternative theory, okay? Economic interdependence is an alternative theory, right? He is effectively saying that there are considerations that are very important that John is not considering that will produce peace, okay? So my theory leaves that out. There's also, believe it or not, the most powerful theory intellectually, forget China, the most powerful theory against my position is, I believe, what's called democratic peace theory. And the argument is that democracies never fight other democracies. It's not that democracies are more peaceful. That goes back to what we were talking about before. Nobody's arguing that the United States is peaceful because it's a democracy. The argument is democracies do not fight other democracies. It's called democratic peace theory. It's a fundamentally different theory than mine. Because remember, I said I don't care whether it's a democracy, a fascist state, a communist state. States are black boxes for me. But democratic peace theory cares about the kind of regime you have. It says if you have two democracies, no peace, right? That's an alternative theory. It's a completely different theory than mine, and it predicts a different outcome. It says that if China becomes a democracy and the United States is a democracy, we live happily ever after. And what I find amazing, just for your information, is I have never heard a single person make that argument against me, in contrast to economic interdependence theory.
Thank you. When we talk about structural theories, we talk about abstractions. Now, at some point, we have to introduce alternative factors. And as a realist, you will certainly admit that geography is one of the most important factors that realists look at in addition to power. There is the argument that a lot of realist authors make, like Robert Ross, who's saying, well, you can't just look at the distribution of power between the dyad, the United States and China. You also have to look to see if there is a particular flashpoint based on geography. And his point was that in the Cold War, that flashpoint was Germany and Western Europe, because that would upset the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. And Ross makes the case that there really is no similar situation in Eastern Europe where a particular location would disrupt the balance of power between China and the United States, and which is why he entitled his article "The Geography of Peace."
Okay, good. I think that the geography of the Cold War was fundamentally different than the geography that will exist in a U.S.-China competition. And I think it is as Eric described it, but I want to embellish the argument. And I want to try and make the point that I think war is more likely between China and the United States than it was during the Cold War, building on what he said. During the Cold War, as he pointed out, the center of gravity in the competition was Central Europe. When we used to run war games, everything in a war between the United States and the Soviet Union got pulled into Europe. It was like a giant magnet, right? The inter-German border. That's where the money was, okay? However, we could never get a war started when we ran war games. And the reason is that a war in Central Europe would have been World War III with nuclear weapons. And World War III with nuclear weapons would have meant we all got vaporized. And nobody wanted to get vaporized. So it was actually a remarkably stable situation in Europe. He points out, quite correctly, that there is no equivalent. This is the Bob Ross argument as well, of course, that he was referring to. There is no equivalent to the Central Front in Asia. And in fact, when you look at Asia and you say to yourself, where are the potential conflict situations? These are them. 1, North Korea, South Korea. 2, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, right? 3, Taiwan. And 4, the South China Seas, where you have a handful of islands and all sorts of claims about, which part of the water belongs to which country and so forth and so on. These are potential conflict situations that bear no resemblance to the Central Front. And you can hypothesize a situation where you have a war over the Senkaku Islands. That was the point I made to this gentleman before. It is possible that you could have a war over the Senkaku Islands. You could have a war over Korea. Would anybody rule out a war between North Korea and South Korea? And by the way, you remember what happened the last time North Korea and South Korea got into a war. The United States got pulled in, the Chinese got pulled in. And for those of you who don't know much about the Korean War, we did not end up fighting North Koreans between 1950 and 1953. It was the United States fighting the Chinese. The United States fighting the Chinese, right? So we could end up in a shooting match over Korea. We could end up in a shooting match over Taiwan. Is it likely? I'm not making that argument. But the point that I'm making to you is, given the geography of a future competition between China and the United States, which, as you point out, is so different than the Cold War, right? I think the potential for conflict is actually significantly greater, which is not to say we will axiomatically have a war.
Sir, you stated that China was the main question of the 21st century, and I would offer another candidate, which is the integration of Islam into the world order. And maybe that may be the question for the 22nd, 25th century. What's your comment? And maybe we can have a Harper lecture on this subject.
Are we going to give me another hour? I'm dangerous, so you should be careful what you ask for. No, my simple answer is I don't pay that much attention to Islam. I believe that we live in a world of nation states, and there are all sorts of Islamic states that fight against other Islamic states. This is kind of like the clash of civilization argument that Sam Huntington made, because I don't think that it makes much sense to talk about Islam as some sort of unified force in the sense that Sam Huntington did when he talked about clash of civilization. I believe that the world is a place where the most powerful political ideology is nationalism, and that those Islamic states in the Middle East are basically nation states that like or dislike each other for a whole variety of reasons, some of which have to do with Islam and some don't. Look at Iran and Saudi Arabia, Shia versus Sunni, right? These are just states. And there's some Islamic states that the United States gets along with very well, and some Islamic states that we don't get along with. So I think the world is just much more variegated, and it's because of nationalism, and that Islam, although it is a force, is just not a terribly important force. And by the way, I felt the same way about communism. I thought that during the Cold War, we obsessed about communism. We thought that there was this monolithic force out there called communism, and anybody who had a communist label was against us. Remember what happened in Southeast Asia, right? China and Vietnam went to war. Cambodia and Vietnam went to war. You remember the Sino-Soviet split. You remember Tito in Yugoslavia. If we were sophisticated, and of course we're never sophisticated, right, we would have played off on all these differences among these communist states. And the same thing applies with Islam. So I think we just get too wrapped around the axle, with all due respect, to worrying about things like Islam or communism.
What about India? How does India figure into this? I guess my question is, or my argument is, China may never achieve the kind of power differential that America achieve relative to its neighbor, because it's surrounded by powerful nations like India, or nations with tremendous potential like India, Russia, and Japan. So it's never really able to achieve that kind of power differential, and maybe never able to achieve regional hegemon status.
I hope you're right, as I said before. First of all, with regard to Japan, Japan is the most rapidly aging population, has the most rapidly aging population in the world, and it's decreasing in power. And the Russians are not in much better shape. So it is possible that the Chinese will open the gap between themselves and Japan and themselves and Russia. India, on the other hand, has a population that is growing. The United States and India are the two countries that are in the best shape demographically among either great powers or potential great powers. The problem that India has is that it has a huge number of people who are illiterate. So it has a real human capital problem. It also has a rather dysfunctional political system. And I don't think there's any chance of India, Gesundheit, I don't think there's any chance of India becoming, a potential hegemon in Asia the way we worry about China. I think if there's any country that can do it, it's the Chinese, not the Indians, and certainly not the Japanese and the Russians. I think they'll all be part of the balancing coalition, though.
Given how quickly new potential hegemons have risen from the ashes, which is our experience with both China and Germany, certainly. Why not Russia? With all its resources, with its atomic arsenal, why couldn't they suddenly decide to move into the role of potential hegemon?
Yeah, somebody just said demographics. The main reason that the Russians are in really deep trouble is demographics. right? This is a country that's depopulating. Demographics is the principal reason in the Russian case why they're not going to be a potential competitor. Well, also, you want to remember when the Soviet Union broke apart, basically the size of the country was cut in half. Russia's about half the size of the Soviet Union, and it's depopulating. And it has all sorts of economic problems. This is not to say it could never happen. Demographics, by the way, is a subject of enormous importance for thinking about sort of where the world is headed. I mean, Germany is today the biggest and most powerful country in Europe. By the year 2050, Britain will have replaced Germany as the most populous country in Europe. The British population is growing at a quite steep clip, and Germany is depopulating. And this just is going to have huge consequences over time. Of course, you can never underestimate how important immigration is for making the United States great, right? I mean, it's immigration that turned us into this incredibly powerful country. And it's also immigration that sustains our demographic growth because it's not only people coming into the country, but if you look at what women are having babies, right, it's recent immigrants who are now American citizens who really push the numbers up. And it's terribly important to have a growing population. And a lot of these countries like Germany, Japan, are in real trouble.
Hi. Given that capability underpins your theory, what role will nuclear weapons and integrated missile defense play in a potential U.S.-China security conflict and a potential ensuing conflict?
Yeah. Everybody heard that? I'm going to try and make sure I don't lose the microphone when I talk. Just let me take them in reverse order. Missile defense, then nuclear weapons. I think that missile defense is not a serious issue. I can't believe how much money we've spent on missile defense and how people talk about missile defense as a serious way of dealing with threats. I was in the Air Force and I worked in Air Force research and development for 5 years, and I worked on ballistic missiles. I worked on the MX missile. I know a lot about missile warheads. Spent a lot of time dealing with missiles sent from Green River in Utah down to White Sands in New Mexico. We can defeat any missile defense like that. And missile defense is not possible against somebody who has an even semi-sophisticated ballistic missile capability. I just can't believe how missile defense gets trumped into this serious issue. But anyway, nuclear weapons, a different issue. I think if you're going to argue against me, the first place you go is nuclear weapons. So her first argument's the first place to go against me, right? What you really want to do is you want to take the nuclear weapons argument, you want to marry it with the economic interdependence argument, right? We can, and then marry it with the nationalism argument. I won't elaborate on that, but that's how to argue against me. Let's just say a few words about nuclear weapons. First of all, you make the argument that nuclear weapons pretty much make it impossible for China to get really aggressive, especially with the United States. I mean, it's possible that could be a fight over the Senkaku Islands or over Taiwan, but both sides will go to enormous lengths to make sure the war does not escalate because of the threat of nuclear weapons being used. And furthermore, you just can't have a great power war. This is what I told you about the Cold War. Why was Central Europe so stable? Remember what I said about the Central Front. We could not get a war going in Central Europe because it would be World War III with nuclear weapons. So basically, just to take your point, India has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons, China has nuclear weapons, the United States has nuclear weapons, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and Japan might very well have them in due course. So given all those nuclear armed states, everybody is going to be extremely cautious And there's no chance in that world that the Chinese can push us out or we can do anything to really damage China. So that would be the argument that I would make, and I'd marry it to the economic interdependence argument and the argument that nationalism makes conquest difficult. And that's how I would argue against myself. But I still think I'm right.
Thank you. I appreciate what you said about the black box and not paying attention to what's happening inside the country. And at the same time, I think the reason we care about this is because we're a democracy and China isn't, and there are, human rights problems in China. So do you think there's any connection between their growing economic stability and maybe someday they're becoming better at human rights and more like us?
Boy, that's a question I'm not sure I should go near. Well, if they become a democracy, right, the argument that many people would make, many IR scholars would make, that and I think it's fits with the flavor of your remarks, that the United States and China would not be antagonists. The situation I described would not obtain because they would be more like us. And because we are good guys in your story, right? We're good guys in your story. They would be good guys. And if the world is populated by good guys, then you live happily ever after, right? That's your view. My argument is that it doesn't matter whether countries are democratic or not, because in an anarchic system, you can never be sure about the intentions of other states, even democracies. But even if I would concede that democracies tend to be good guys, what if a country is a democracy, but then it backslides and stops being a democracy? So my argument is that states are always very wary about each other, even if they're democratic or not. But you are, in a very important way, explicating an alternative theory. It's democratic peace theory in slightly different words. And I just don't buy it. And which is not to say I'm right, you're wrong, but it's just, okay.
Last question.
That's quite an obligation. If I was the President of the United States, and I think that the Mearsheimer theory is the best theory out there, 75% chance it's right, what policy should I be pursuing right now? And furthermore, why don't I, since China's growing faster than we are, try to get the highest stakes war I possibly can as quickly as possible?
Yeah. This is a great question, and there's just all sorts of issues embedded in it. Right. First of all, he's laying out the preventive war argument, okay? The argument is if John is correct, or there's a reasonably good chance John is correct, then you want to cut them off at the knees now before they grow, okay? And therefore, why not launch a preventive war? And by the way, this is why I think Germany started World War I. I believe Germany is principally responsible for World War I, and it was because they were trying to cut the Russians off at the knees in August 1914. We can't do it. And we can't do it because there's no way we can figure out how to cut the Chinese down to size without precipitating a nuclear war, right? You understand that when the Russians first developed nuclear weapons and when the Chinese first developed nuclear weapons, in both cases, we thought long and hard about a preventive war. And we decided it was just not worth it. And that's where we're at today with regard to preventive war. It just makes no sense, okay? That's point number one. Point number two is China's neighbors, and this is especially true of the Vietnamese and the Philippines, they understand the basic logic that this gentleman laid out. His logic says time is on China's side, right? This is what I always tell the Chinese when I go to Beijing. Don't cause any trouble. Just wait. Wait until you're Godzilla. And then you just come in and you impose the rules. You just say, we're Godzilla. Here are the rules. You either obey them or we crush your skulls. It's just very simple, right? You do not want to pick a fight now because you're not powerful enough. But you see, people in the Philippines and people in Vietnam understand this logic. And the flip side of it is, now is the time, if you're going to settle an issue, to do it. So the Filipinos would like to settle the question of who controls these particular islands or pieces of rock in the South China Sea. You don't want to wait till China is Godzilla. It's that kind of argument. And I believe that if you were to look at all the controversies over the past 5 years between China and its neighbors, that its neighbors precipitated almost every one of those conflicts, right? And in fact, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Shui Tiankai, he made that point in an interview in Foreign Affairs this past summer. I think he's correct. Because the Chinese understand time is on their side. The neighbors understand time is not on their side, right? So they're the ones who've been precipitating the conflicts. The Chinese, in my opinion, have overreacted and in the process scared all their neighbors, plus scared the United States. But that's a different matter. But the basic problem that we face is that it's hard to see how you can slow down Chinese growth to head off this problem at the pass.
Please join me in thanking Professor Mearsheimer.